The laughter started before Eleanor Hartley even reached the top of the stairs. She stopped with her hand on the banister, the tray of folded linens pressed against her hip, and listened to the sound rolling down from the drawing room like something thrown at her on purpose. She knew that laugh. It belonged to Duke Julian Ashworth, and it never meant anything good for the servants of Camden House. "Say it again," someone urged him, a woman's voice, high and delighted. "Say it to her face, Julian. I want to see it." Eleanor set the tray down slowly on the hall table, her fingers tightening around the edge of it until her knuckles turned pale. She had learned, in 3 years of service in this house, that the safest thing a maid could do was become invisible. She kept her eyes down. She kept her voice soft. She never let anyone see what she was thinking, because what she was thinking, most days, was that she did not belong scrubbing floors that her own grandmother would once have walked across as a guest. But invisibility had limits, and tonight, apparently, hers had run out. "Hartley." The Duke's voice cut through the hallway like a blade through silk. "Come here." She smoothed her apron, straightened her spine, and walked into the drawing room with her chin level, because that was the only defense she had left. 6 people turned to look at her. Julian Ashworth sat in the center of them in his dark green coat, a glass of wine forgotten in his hand, his pale eyes bright with something that was not kindness. "There she is," he said, and smiled the way a cat smiles at something it intends to play with before it eats it. "Eleanor Hartley. Tell me, do you know what a formal dinner is?" A few of his friends snickered. A young woman in a rose-colored gown, Lady Cordelia Whitmore, the Duke's cousin, covered her mouth with a gloved hand, though her eyes danced with cruel amusement above her fingers. "I do, Your Grace," Eleanor said evenly. "Good, because you are invited to one. Here, Saturday evening, 8 o'clock. He let the words sit in the air, watching her face for the crack he expected to see. "You will sit at my table, among my guests, dressed as befits the occasion, and you will dine with us, as though you were one of us." The room erupted into laughter, sharp and bright and utterly without mercy. Lord Reginald Price, a heavy-set man with small cunning eyes, actually clapped his hands together. Someone else said something about hoping she remembered which fork to use, and the laughter climbed higher. Eleanor did not move. She did not flinch. Something cold and clear settled over her, the way ice settles over a pond in the first true frost of winter, and beneath that ice, something else began to burn. "Well?" Julian pressed, when the laughter thinned enough for his voice to be heard. "Have you nothing to say?" "I accept, Your Grace," she said quietly. "Saturday, 8 o'clock. That answer, calm and unshaken, seemed to unsettle him more than any protest would have. His smile faltered, just slightly, before he recovered it, and waved a dismissive hand toward the door. "Go on then, back to your linens." She turned and walked out of that drawing room with her back straight and her hands steady, and it was not until she had climbed 2 flights of stairs and shut the door of the small room she shared with another maid, that her composure finally broke, and she stood alone in the dark, breathing hard, her whole body shaking with a fury she had never once, in 3 years, allowed herself to feel out loud. Margaret found her there 20 minutes later, curled on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I heard," Margaret said softly, closing the door behind her. "The whole servants' hall heard. Eleanor, you cannot possibly go through with it." "I already told him I would." "He means to humiliate you, in front of half the county. You know that." "I know exactly what he means," Eleanor said, and there was something in her voice that made Margaret go still. "He has spent 3 years looking straight through me as though I were a piece of furniture. He does not know the first thing about who I am." Margaret studied her carefully, the way she might study a stranger. "What do you mean?" Eleanor did not answer right away. Instead, she rose from the bed and crossed to the small trunk that sat beneath the window, the one piece of luggage she had brought with her when she first arrived at Camden House, the one she had never once opened in front of another living soul. Her fingers hovered over the worn brass latch. "My father," she said slowly, "was Baron Charles Hartley of Ashcombe." Margaret's mouth fell open. The Baron who lost everything? The one who gambled away the estate and died owing more than he had ever owned. Eleanor finished for her, and there was no self-pity in her voice, only a flat, hard honesty that had clearly cost her something to speak aloud. "I was 12. I have spent 8 years since then learning how to disappear, because a girl with a ruined name and no money is safer as nobody at all than as somebody people whisper about." She lifted the lid of the trunk. "But I was not born to scrub floors, Margaret. I was born to sit at tables, like the one the Duke intends to mock me at. And if he wants to see me there on Saturday, then by God, he is going to see exactly who he invited." Margaret came to kneel beside her. peering into the trunk as Eleanor lifted out a folded length of deep blue silk, faded slightly with age but still beautiful, still unmistakably fine. Beneath it lay a small case, and inside that case, wrapped carefully in soft cloth, a string of pearls that caught what little light the room offered, and threw it back in a pale, quiet glow. "My mother's," Eleanor said. "It is all I kept. I told myself I would never need it again." "You could sell that," Margaret whispered, awestruck. "You could sell it, and leave this place and never look back." "I thought about it, more than once, when the winters were hardest." Eleanor ran her thumb gently over the pearls. "But I think, now, I have a better use for it." Downstairs, in the drawing room he had just emptied of servants and filled instead with the satisfied laughter of his friends, Julian Ashworth refilled his glass and allowed himself to feel, for the first time in weeks, thoroughly entertained. "You are a devil, Julian," Lady Cordelia said, settling back into her chair with a delighted little shiver. Truly, the poor girl looked as though she might faint. She did not look as though she might faint, Lord Reginald observed, frowning slightly over the rim of his glass. She looked, if anything, rather too calm about the whole affair. "Calm because she has not yet understood what Saturday will mean for her," Julian said, and there was an edge beneath his careless tone, something harder and older than mere cruelty for its own sake. His mother had died the year before, worn thin by years of pretending the family's finances were sound, when they were, in fact, a slow, collapsing ruin, and his father before her had left behind a name more valuable than the money attached to it. Julian had learned early that rank was armor, and that those without it existed largely to remind men like him of the distance between themselves and everyone else. It was not that he hated the girl. He barely thought of her as a person at all. She was simply a convenient reminder to his circle, and perhaps to himself, of exactly where the lines were drawn. "And if she does not understand it even then," Reginald pressed. "Then I will make certain she does," Julian said, and drank. He did not think of her again that night, or told himself he did not. But later, alone in his study with the household gone quiet around him, he found his mind returning, unbidden, to the way she had stood in that drawing room, not trembling, not begging, simply looking at him with those steady gray eyes, as though he were the one who ought to be ashamed. It irritated him more than he cared to admit. He poured himself another drink and told himself it would pass by morning. Upstairs, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed long after Margaret had fallen asleep, the blue silk spread across her lap, the pearls cool against her palm. Saturday was 5 days away. 5 days to remember everything her mother had once taught her about how a lady of quality carried herself, how she spoke, how she looked at a room full of people who believed themselves superior and made them, without ever raising her voice, feel exactly how small their cruelty truly was. She had spent 8 years learning to be invisible. She had not forgotten how to be seen. Outside her small window, the last candle in the Duke's study finally went dark, and Camden House settled into silence, unaware that within its walls a quiet reckoning had already begun. The next morning, Eleanor rose before dawn as she always did, but for the first time in years she did not dress with her usual haste. She stood before the small cracked mirror propped against the wall and studied her own reflection for a long moment, searching not for the tired maid who scrubbed floors and carried linens, but for traces of the girl she had once been, the daughter of a baron who had sat through dancing lessons and French lessons, and had once, at the age of 10, been presented to a room full of important guests without a single tremor in her voice. That girl was still in there. She had simply been buried under years of survival. She went about her duties that day with the same quiet efficiency she always showed, and if anyone noticed a new stillness in her, a new watchfulness in the way she observed the household around her, they said nothing of it. Word of the Duke's cruel invitation had spread through the servants' hall by breakfast, and opinions were sharply divided. Some pitied her outright. Others, more cautious, kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with whatever humiliation Saturday might bring. Only Margaret remained steadily at her side, watching her with a mixture of worry and growing curiosity that Eleanor did not yet know how to answer. By the time the candles were lit that evening, Eleanor had already begun to plan. Eleanor did not sleep the second night either, but this time it was not fear keeping her awake. It was calculation. She sat cross-legged on her narrow bed with a stub of candle burning low beside her, counting the days on her fingers as though the numbers themselves might rearrange into something kinder. 5 days had become 4. 4 would become 3 by the time she woke. She needed a dressmaker who could work fast and keep quiet. She needed her mother's silk taken in and restyled to fit a body that had grown thinner on servants' rations than it had been at 17. And she needed, more than anything, to remember how to walk into a room as though she owned it. "You are certain about this," Margaret whispered from the other bed, still awake despite the hour. "I have never been more certain of anything," Eleanor said. "The dressmaker in the village, Mrs. Original, will not do it. She answers to the house too closely. She would tell the housekeeper before the sun rose." Eleanor had already thought of this. Not her. "There is a woman 2 villages over, in Brackenfield. My mother used her once, years ago, before everything fell apart. If she is still alive, she may remember the name Hartley kindly enough to help." "And how do you intend to get to Brackenfield and back without anyone noticing you are gone?" This was the harder question, and Eleanor turned it over for a long moment before answering. "Sunday is my half-day. I will go then, and again on Wednesday if I must. It will have to be enough." It was not, strictly speaking, enough, but Eleanor had learned long ago that very little in life arrived in the shape one wished for, and that the task was not to wait for ideal conditions, but to work with whatever hours and coins and courage one actually possessed. On Sunday, she walked the 4 miles to Brackenfield in her plainest dress, her mother's blue silk wrapped carefully in brown paper and tucked beneath her arm, her heart hammering the entire way with a fear that had nothing to do with the Duke and everything to do with hope, which she had learned was often the more dangerous feeling of the two. The dressmaker, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Pemberton, opened her door with evident suspicion until Eleanor said her mother's name, and something in the older woman's face softened at once. "Hartley," Mrs. Pemberton repeated slowly. "I made your mother's wedding dress, child. I have not heard that name spoken aloud in years." She studied Eleanor's plain servant's dress, her work-worn hands, and something like sorrow crossed her features before she stepped back and held the door wide. "Come in then. Let us see what can be done." What could be done, it turned out, was a great deal. Mrs. Pemberton examined the blue silk with the practiced eye of a woman who had spent 40 years reading fabric the way scholars read books, running her fingers along the seams, testing the give of the material, murmuring measurements under her breath. "It will need taking in through the bodice," she said. "You have grown thinner, since whoever last wore this, and the sleeves are out of fashion by a decade at least. But we can update them without wasting the cloth. 3 days, if I work through the nights." She glanced up sharply. "Why the hurry, if I may ask?" Eleanor hesitated only a moment before deciding that honesty, at least with this woman, was the safer path. "I am to attend a dinner at Camden House, as a joke, at the Duke's invitation, meant to shame me in front of his guests." Mrs. Pemberton's mouth thinned into a hard line. "Ashworth. I know the name. His mother was a fine woman, God rest her. But that boy has grown up thinking his title excuses any manner of unkindness." She set the silk aside and looked at Eleanor with new intensity. "You mean to surprise him? I mean to remind him what a Hartley looks like when she is not scrubbing his floors." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of Mrs. Pemberton's mouth. "Then we had better make certain he never forgets it." The days that followed passed in a blur of stolen moments. Eleanor scrubbed floors and carried linens and answered summonses with the same downcast eyes she always wore, giving no household member reason to suspect anything had changed, while beneath that careful performance her mind raced constantly toward Saturday. She returned to Brackenfield twice more, each time slipping away during the narrow windows of freedom her position allowed, each time returning breathless and anxious that she had been gone too long, that someone would notice, that the entire plan would collapse before it had even begun. It did not collapse. If anything, it grew stronger with each visit. Mrs. Pemberton, it turned out, had once dressed half the great houses of the county before age, and changing fashion narrowed her clientele, and her memory for the small details that separated true elegance from mere costume had not dimmed in the slightest. She showed Eleanor how to fix her hair in a style both fashionable and dignified, using nothing but pins she already owned. She reminded her of the particular way a lady held her fan, not fluttering it nervously but resting it, unhurried, against her palm, as though she had all the time in the world, and no need to prove otherwise to anyone in the room. "Your mother used to say that composure was the truest mark of breeding," Mrs. Pemberton told her, on the last afternoon before the dinner, as she made her final adjustments to the bodice. "Anyone can wear silk. Very few people can wear silence the way she could." She would walk into a room and simply wait, and somehow everyone else would find themselves waiting too, wondering what she thought of them, when in truth she had barely noticed they existed. "I do not know if I remember how to do that," Eleanor admitted quietly. "You remember more than you think, child. It is not something learned. It is something returned to." Mrs. Pemberton stepped back, studying her work with a critical eye, then nodded once, satisfied. "There, try it on." Eleanor slipped behind the small dressing screen and emerged a few minutes later in the finished gown, deep blue silk that caught the afternoon light and turned it into something rich and shifting. The bodice fitted close, the sleeves modest but elegant, the skirt falling in clean, unbroken lines to the floor. Mrs. Pemberton had added a narrow band of ivory lace at the collar, simple but perfectly placed. And when Eleanor turned to face the small mirror propped against the wall, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. "Oh," she said softly, and her voice caught in her throat. "There she is," Mrs. Pemberton said, with something like pride. "There is Baron Hartley's daughter." Back at Camden House, the household prepared for Saturday's dinner with an entirely different sort of anticipation. The Duke had made certain, in his own quiet way, that half the county would be present to witness whatever spectacle he had planned, extending invitations to families he knew would relish a story to carry home and repeat at their own dinner tables for months afterward. Lady Cordelia had spent the week telling anyone who would listen about the maid who fancied she could dine among her betters, embellishing the tale with each retelling until it bore only passing resemblance to the actual events in the drawing room. Lord Reginald, for his part, had wagered a considerable sum with two other gentlemen over how quickly the girl would break down in tears once seated at the table. Julian himself said little about it as the week progressed, though he found himself, more than once, standing at his study window in the evenings, watching the small light burning in the upstairs servants' quarters and wondering, against his own better judgment, what exactly Eleanor Hartley was doing up there so late into the night. He told himself it did not matter. He told himself the same thing every evening, and every evening it convinced him a little less. On Friday, the day before the dinner, he summoned the housekeeper, Mrs. Bell, to his study. "Everything is arranged for tomorrow?" he asked, without looking up from the papers on his desk. "It is, Your Grace." Mrs. Bell's voice carried a note of careful neutrality that had not been there in previous conversations about the matter. "Though I confess I do not fully understand the purpose of it." Julian glanced up, faintly surprised by the comment. Mrs. Bell had run his household for 11 years and rarely offered opinions unasked. "The purpose is entertainment for my guests, Mrs. Bell." "Nothing more complicated than that." "Of course, Your Grace." She hesitated at the door, then added, "Eleanor Hartley has been a good and faithful servant in this house. I have never once had cause to speak a hard word to her. That is not the point." "No, Your Grace," Mrs. Bell agreed, and left the room without further comment, though something in her tone lingered in Julian's mind long after she had gone, a small, uncomfortable seed of doubt that he did not yet know how to name. Saturday arrived gray and overcast, the kind of English afternoon that threatened rain without ever quite delivering it, and by the time evening fell, Camden House blazed with candlelight in every window, carriages already beginning to arrive along the gravel drive, laughter and conversation drifting up from the great hall, as guests gathered in anticipation of an evening they had all been promised would be memorable. Upstairs, in the small room she shared with Margaret, Eleanor stood perfectly still, while her friend fastened the last of the tiny buttons at the back of her gown, her hands trembling slightly with nerves that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the strange, unfamiliar weight of finally becoming, again, exactly who she had always been. "You look like her," Margaret whispered, stepping back to take in the full effect. "Your mother. I never met her, but I imagine this is exactly how she must have looked." Eleanor studied her own reflection one final time, the pearls cool against her collarbone, her hair arranged in soft waves that framed a face no longer downcast but lifted, steady, ready. 8 o'clock, she said quietly, more to herself than to Margaret. "Let us go and remind them all who they invited to dinner." The great hall of Camden House had never looked more magnificent, nor more crowded with people eager to witness a humiliation they believed was already guaranteed. Julian stood near the head of the long dining table, greeting his guests with the easy charm he had perfected over years of practice, accepting congratulations on hosting such an amusing evening, laughing along with jokes about the maid who would soon be seated among them. Lady Cordelia hovered near his elbow in a gown of pale pink, her eyes bright with anticipation, while Lord Reginald had already collected wagers from no fewer than 5 gentlemen regarding the exact moment Eleanor Hartley would flee the room in tears. "She will not even make it through the first course," Reginald predicted confidently, accepting a glass of wine from a passing footman. "Mark my words." "I have half a mind to feel sorry for the girl," murmured Lady Whitcomb, an older woman seated near the fireplace, though her tone suggested curiosity rather than genuine sympathy. "What manner of dinner conversation can a maid possibly offer?" "None whatsoever, I should think," Cordelia said, with a delicate little laugh. "Which is rather the entire point, is it not, Julian?" Julian smiled and said nothing, though a small, unfamiliar unease had settled somewhere beneath his ribs, one he could not entirely account for, and did not particularly wish to examine. He had told himself all week that this was simple entertainment, harmless and deserved, a lesson for a servant who had perhaps grown too comfortable in her position, standing there in the drawing room with that infuriatingly steady gaze as though she had nothing whatsoever to fear from him. And yet the closer the evening drew, the less certain he felt about what, precisely, he had set into motion. The great clock in the hall struck 8. The room fell into an expectant hush, dozens of eyes turning toward the wide double doors at the far end of the hall, waiting for the moment they had all gathered to witness. The doors opened. Eleanor stepped through them. For a long moment, no one in the hall made a single sound. She stood in the doorway in deep blue silk that caught the candlelight and turned it into something alive, her hair arranged with quiet elegance, her mother's pearls resting pale against her collarbone, her chin lifted and her shoulders set with a composure that belonged unmistakably to someone who had been raised, from her earliest years, to enter rooms exactly like this one. She did not rush forward. She did not hesitate at the threshold the way a frightened servant might. She simply paused, allowing the room a moment to look at her, and then walked forward with slow, unhurried grace, each step measured, each movement deliberate, as though she were the one deciding whether this gathering was worthy of her attention rather than the other way around. Lord Reginald's wineglass stopped halfway to his mouth. Lady Cordelia's delighted smile faltered and slid slowly from her face. Julian felt something in his chest tighten in a way he did not have a name for, watching the maid he had summoned as an object of ridicule move through his dining hall like she had been born to occupy exactly this space, and had simply been waiting, patiently, for the world to remember it. "Good evening, Your Grace," Eleanor said, stopping before him and offering a curtsy so precisely correct, so perfectly measured in its depth and timing, that it could only have been learned in a nursery devoted to exactly such instruction, years before any of them had known her name. "Thank you for the invitation. I understand it was extended with great care." The words were polite. The words were, on their surface, entirely proper, and yet something in the way she said them, the faint, knowing edge beneath the courtesy, made it unmistakably clear that she understood exactly what he had intended, and had come anyway, and was not the one who ought to feel ashamed tonight. "Miss Hartley," Julian managed, and found, to his own considerable surprise, that he did not know what else to say. "Please," she said, with a small, gracious smile that did not reach the coldness in her eyes, "call me Eleanor. We are all friends here this evening, are we not?" A ripple of uncertain, startled laughter moved through the assembled guests, though it carried none of the cruel anticipation of earlier in the week. Something had shifted in the room's atmosphere, subtle but unmistakable, the balance of power tilting in a direction none of them had prepared for. Dinner proceeded, and Eleanor navigated it with a fluency that left the assembled company increasingly unsettled. She used the correct fork without hesitation, without even the slightest downward glance to confirm her choice. She engaged in conversation about literature, about music, about the state of the roads between London and the county, with an ease and intelligence that put several of the gathered gentlemen, who had come expecting to laugh at her expense, quietly on the defensive instead. "You are remarkably well spoken for a maid," Lord Reginald said at one point, unable to entirely mask the edge of hostility beneath his forced smile. "Wherever did you learn such manners?" "From my mother," Eleanor said simply, meeting his gaze without flinching, "as I imagine you learned yours from your own, Lord Reginald, though I confess I have not yet observed the resemblance." A sharp intake of breath moved around the table. Somewhere near the far end, someone smothered a laugh badly enough that it escaped as a cough. Reginald's face reddened, though he found no ready response, and turned his attention instead to his wineglass with considerably more focus than the vintage strictly warranted. Lady Cordelia, watching this exchange with narrowed eyes, leaned toward the woman seated beside her. "She is playing some sort of game," she murmured, low enough that she believed herself unheard. "No maid speaks like that. No maid carries herself like that." But if it was a game, Eleanor played it flawlessly, course after course, question after probing question, never once allowing her composure to crack, never once giving the assembled company the satisfaction they had come hoping to witness. When one of the younger guests asked, with poorly concealed condescension, whether she found her duties at Camden House agreeable, Eleanor answered without a trace of bitterness that every position taught a person something worth knowing, and that she had learned a great deal these past 3 years about the true character of the people she served. The comment landed with quiet, devastating precision, and several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly aware that the joke they had gathered to enjoy had somehow, without their quite understanding how, turned itself around to point back at them. Julian said little throughout the meal, watching Eleanor with an intensity he could not fully suppress, no matter how he tried to redirect his attention elsewhere. He had known her for 3 years as a servant, a quiet presence in the corners of his household, someone he had barely troubled himself to truly see. He had not known, until tonight, that there was an entire person behind that quiet presence, someone with wit sharp enough to hold her own against a room full of people determined to humiliate her, someone with a composure that made his own carefully cultivated arrogance feel, for the first time in his adult life, faintly ridiculous. "You are unusually quiet this evening, Your Grace," Eleanor observed, near the meal's end, turning her steady gray eyes on him directly for the first time since she had entered the hall. "I hope I have not disappointed you." The barb was subtle and devastatingly effective. Every guest at the table understood exactly what she meant, and several of them struggled visibly to suppress their amusement at the Duke's evident discomfort. "Not at all," Julian said, recovering himself with effort. "I find myself reconsidering a great many assumptions." "How fortunate," Eleanor said, with a small, knowing smile. "I find that reconsideration is often the first honest thing a person does in their entire life." The dinner concluded an hour later than planned, the guests lingering far longer than anyone had anticipated, drawn into conversation with the maid they had come to mock and finding themselves, almost against their will, genuinely engaged by her company. As the evening finally wound down and carriages began departing along the gravel drive, Eleanor rose from her seat with the same unhurried grace with which she had entered, offered the assembled company a final, perfectly measured curtsy, and turned to leave the hall. "Miss Hartley," Julian said, before he had fully decided to speak at all. "Eleanor." She paused at the threshold and turned back to face him, her expression unreadable in the candlelight. "I owe you an apology," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it. "I did not intend for this evening to unfold as it has." "No," she agreed. "You intended it to unfold rather differently, Your Grace. I am simply not the woman you assumed you were inviting." "Who are you, then?" Something flickered across her face, brief and complicated, gone before he could fully read it. "That," she said, "is a story for another evening. Good night, Your Grace." And with that, she walked out through the double doors and into the darkened hallway beyond, leaving him standing alone at the head of his own table, surrounded by the wreckage of an evening that had gone entirely, thoroughly, unforgettably wrong for everyone except the one person he had meant to humble. By morning, the story of Saturday's dinner had already begun spreading through the county faster than any carriage could travel. Julian learned this over breakfast, when Mrs. Bell entered with his tea and, with careful neutrality, mentioned that 3 separate notes had already arrived from neighboring households, each one inquiring, in varying degrees of thinly disguised curiosity, about the identity of the remarkable young woman who had dined at Camden House the previous evening. "They believe her to be a poor relation," Mrs. Bell said, "or a companion brought in from London. No one seems to have guessed the truth. And you have said nothing to correct them." "It was not my place to explain, Your Grace." Mrs. Bell set the tea down and hesitated a moment longer than usual before continuing. "Though I confess I am glad someone finally saw her clearly." Julian said nothing to this, staring instead at the folded notes on the silver tray, aware of a restlessness in himself that had not eased since Eleanor had walked out of his dining hall the night before. He had built his entire understanding of the world on a simple, unexamined assumption that rank and worth were the same thing, that a servant remained a servant no matter what silk she might wear or what wit she might display, and that assumption had cracked open sometime around the second course, and had not stopped cracking since. He found himself, against every instinct of dignity he possessed, seeking her out that very afternoon. He discovered her in the small garden behind the kitchens, where she often took what little free time her duties allowed, sitting on an old stone bench with a book open in her lap, though her eyes were fixed somewhere past the pages, on the hedges beyond, lost in thought. "Miss Hartley," he said, and she looked up, startled, quickly rising to her feet in the automatic deference of 3 years' habit, before catching herself and standing instead with the same quiet composure she had shown at his table. "Your Grace, I did not mean to interrupt." "You did not." She closed the book carefully, marking her place with a strip of ribbon. "Though I confess I am surprised to see you here. This is not a part of the house you typically visit." "No," he admitted. "I find I have been thinking about last evening rather more than I anticipated. As have I, though I imagine for rather different reasons." He studied her for a long moment, searching for some trace of the anonymous maid he had summoned to the drawing room 5 days earlier and finding, instead, only this composed and faintly amused young woman, who seemed entirely unbothered by his presence, or his rank, or the awkwardness of the position he now found himself in. "Who taught you to carry yourself as you did?" he asked finally. "My mother," Eleanor said again, the same answer she had given at dinner, though something in her voice suggested there was a great deal more beneath it that she had not yet chosen to share. "And my father, before everything he built came apart." "And what did he build, before it came apart?" She looked at him steadily, weighing something behind her eyes, before she finally answered, "A life not so different from your own, Your Grace, though considerably less careful with it than you have apparently been with yours." It was not a full answer, and they both understood that it was not, but something in her tone made it clear she would say nothing further on the matter today, and Julian, against his own instincts, found himself respecting the boundary rather than pushing past it. "I would like to speak with you again," he said instead. "Properly, not as your employer summoning a servant, but as one person speaking honestly to another." Eleanor considered this for a long moment, and something almost like caution moved across her expression. "You understand, Your Grace, that a great many things stand between us that a single dinner cannot undo. My position in this house, the difference in our stations, the manner in which this entire situation began. I understand all of that. Then I am willing to speak with you," she said, "though I will not pretend that a single evening of your reconsidered assumptions erases 3 years of being treated as though I were invisible." "That is fair," he said, and meant it, and something in the honesty of the admission seemed to ease, just slightly, the wariness in her posture. Word of this new development did not take long to reach less welcoming ears. Lady Cordelia, who had spent the entirety of Sunday attempting to salvage the reputation of an evening that had gone spectacularly against her expectations, learned of the Duke's garden visit from a housemaid eager for a few extra coins, and the news struck her with considerably more alarm than the dinner itself had. "He cannot possibly be serious," she said to Lord Reginald, pacing the length of her sitting room with barely restrained agitation. "A servant, Reginald. Regardless of whatever pretty manners she managed to display, she scrubs his floors. She empties his chamber pots. This is madness." "Perhaps," Reginald said carefully, though his own mind had already moved past outrage and into calculation. He had lost a considerable sum on Saturday's wager, and he had no particular love for the maid who had costed him, but more pressing than his wounded pride was the simple fact that Cordelia's own ambitions toward the Duke, ambitions she had nursed quietly for the better part of 2 years, now stood in genuine jeopardy. But madness or not, we should perhaps discover exactly who this Eleanor Hartley truly is, before matters progress any further. "What do you propose?" "I propose," Reginald said slowly, "that a woman with manners such as hers did not learn them scrubbing floors, and did not arrive at Camden House out of nowhere. Someone, somewhere, knows her history. And history, in my experience, is rarely as flattering as a single well-managed evening might suggest." Cordelia's eyes narrowed with sudden, sharp interest. "You mean to dig into her past?" "I mean," Reginald said with a thin smile, "to remind everyone, including the Duke, precisely why servants remain servants, and dukes remain dukes." Neither of them said the word scandal aloud, but it hung between them regardless, an unspoken understanding that whatever Eleanor Hartley was hiding beneath her borrowed silk and her mother's pearls, it would serve their purposes considerably better exposed than left in comfortable darkness. Over the following days, Julian found himself seeking Eleanor's company with a frequency that surprised even him. Brief conversations in the garden, exchanges in the hallway that lasted longer than any household business required, a growing awareness of her presence in his home that he had somehow managed to overlook for 3 entire years. She remained careful with him, guarded in ways she had not been at the dinner table, as though the performance of that evening had required a kind of courage she did not intend to sustain indefinitely. And yet something in their conversations continued regardless, small and tentative, neither of them quite naming what it was becoming. "You still have not told me everything," he said to her one evening, as she carried a stack of linens across the hall and he fell into step beside her, an arrangement that would have seemed absurd to either of them a week earlier. "No," she agreed, "I have not. Will you?" "When I trust you enough to," she said honestly, "which is not yet, Your Grace, though I confess it is closer than I expected it to be." He accepted this, though the mystery of her gnawed at him more each day, an itch beneath his composure that refused to settle. He did not yet know that in a sitting room across the county, Lord Reginald Price had already dispatched a letter to an old acquaintance in London, a man with connections to the courts and the records of ruined estates, asking pointed questions about a baron named Charles Hartley, and the daughter he had left behind when his debts finally caught up with him. The answer, when it arrived a few days later, would ensure that whatever fragile trust Julian and Eleanor had begun building between them would very shortly be tested by forces neither of them yet saw coming. The letter arrived at Lord Reginald's estate on a wet Thursday morning, and he read it twice through before allowing himself a slow, satisfied smile. His London acquaintance had been thorough. Baron Charles Hartley of Ashcombe, the letter confirmed, had indeed existed, had indeed gambled away an estate that had remained in his family for 4 generations, and had died 8 years earlier, owing debts so substantial that his creditors had stripped the household of everything down to the silver, leaving his widow to die of a broken heart within the year, and his only daughter, a girl of 12, to vanish entirely from public record. There were rumors, the letter added, of the girl entering domestic service under a different arrangement of her own name, though nothing certain could be confirmed. It was more than enough for Reginald's purposes. He did not need certainty. He needed only enough truth wrapped around enough suggestion to accomplish what he intended. He brought the letter to Cordelia that same afternoon, and together they spent the better part of an hour refining exactly how, and where, and to whom, this information might best be revealed. A private word to the Duke would accomplish nothing, Cordelia said, pacing before the fireplace with the letter clutched in her hand. He would simply defend her further, out of pride if nothing else. No, this must be public. It must happen where he cannot quietly smooth it over. The Ashford ball, Reginald suggested. 3 days hence, half the county will be present, including, I understand, the Duke himself, who has apparently taken to bringing his new companion along to various engagements. Perfect, Cordelia said, and there was something almost gleeful in the word, though beneath the satisfaction lay a genuine desperation that neither of them acknowledged aloud, the fear that whatever was growing between Julian and this maid might, if left unchecked, cost Cordelia everything she had spent 2 careful years working toward. Eleanor knew nothing of any of this as the Ashford ball approached, though she felt, in the days leading up to it, a growing unease she could not entirely name. Julian had asked her to attend, formally now, as his guest rather than his servant, a request that had thrown the entire household into quiet confusion, and had earned her more than a few resentful glances from staff, who had once considered her their equal, and now found her elevated to a status none of them fully understood. "You are certain about this?" Margaret asked her, the evening before the ball, watching Eleanor prepare a second gown, another gift from Mrs. Pemberton's careful hands, purchased quietly with coin, Julian had insisted on providing despite Eleanor's initial protests. "I am not certain of anything," Eleanor admitted. "But I have spent 8 years being certain of nothing except my own survival, Margaret. This is the first time in all those years that something has felt like it might be worth the risk. And if it goes wrong?" Eleanor did not have an answer for that, and the question lingered uncomfortably between them, long after the candle had been blown out. The Ashford ball, when it arrived, glittered with exactly the kind of grandeur the county's finest families reserved for occasions meant to be remembered. Chandeliers blazing, an orchestra tuning in the corner of a hall large enough to accommodate 200 guests, and among them, arriving on the Duke's arm in a gown of pale silver that made her look, several guests whispered, like something out of a painting rather than a person, Eleanor Hartley. The whispers followed her through the hall all evening, curious rather than cruel, the county's collective fascination with the mystery the Duke had apparently taken up growing warmer with every dance he claimed at her side, every quiet conversation conducted in full view of guests who had, only 2 weeks earlier, been prepared to laugh her out of the county entirely. It was nearly midnight when Lord Reginald made his move. He waited until the musicians paused between sets, until enough guests had gathered near the refreshment tables that his voice would carry to the widest possible audience, and then he raised his glass in a gesture of mock toast, and spoke loudly enough for half the hall to hear. "A toast," he announced, "to Miss Eleanor Hartley, daughter of the late Baron Charles Hartley of Ashcombe, whose family estate was seized for debt 8 years ago, and whose father died disgraced and penniless, leaving his daughter to scrub the floors of the very houses she once might have visited as an equal." The hall fell into stunned silence. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as every eye in the room turned toward her, the careful composure she had built over 8 years of practiced invisibility threatening, for the first time since Saturday's dinner, to crack entirely under the weight of public exposure she had not chosen and had not prepared for. "That is not," she began, but her voice caught, and Cordelia, standing near Reginald with an expression of carefully arranged sympathy that fooled no one who looked closely enough, seized the opening at once. "Is it not true, Miss Hartley?" Cordelia asked, her voice carrying easily across the stunned hall. Is your father not the same Baron Hartley whose ruin was the talk of London 8 years past? Have you not spent these years since as a common maid, deceiving this entire household, deceiving the Duke himself, about who and what you truly are? I have deceived no one, Eleanor said, finding her voice at last, though it shook slightly with the effort of steadying it. I never claimed to be anything other than what I am. I told the Duke myself, quite plainly, that I had a history I was not yet ready to share. That is not deception, that is privacy. Privacy, Reginald repeated, with a thin, contemptuous smile. How very convenient a word for a servant who dressed herself in silk and pearls to dine among her betters under false pretenses. I was invited, Eleanor said, and now something harder had entered her voice, the fury she had swallowed so carefully at that first cruel invitation, finally finding its way to the surface. I was invited as a joke, Lord Reginald, by a room full of people who wished to watch me humiliated for their entertainment. I did not deceive anyone. I simply refused to give you the humiliation you came hoping to enjoy. A murmur moved through the gathered crowd, some of it sympathetic, some of it scandalized, the entire hall suddenly divided between those who found her defiance admirable, and those who found it, regardless of the circumstances, an unforgivable transgression of the boundaries that separated their world from hers. Julian, who had stood frozen through the opening moments of Reginald's toast, finally found his voice, stepping forward to place himself deliberately at Eleanor's side. Enough, he said, and the single word carried enough authority that the murmuring crowd fell immediately quiet. Lord Reginald, you will explain yourself, and you will do so now, or you will leave my presence in this ball entirely. I owe no explanation, Your Grace, Reginald said, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face at the coldness in the Duke's voice. I have simply revealed a truth this household deserved to know. You have revealed a private history that was never yours to expose, Julian said, and you have done so not out of any concern for truth, but out of spite, because a servant proved more graceful and more intelligent than an entire hall full of guests who came expecting to laugh at her expense. I know precisely what this evening was meant to accomplish, and I will not stand here and allow it to succeed. Julian, Cordelia said, her voice softening into something almost pleading. Surely you cannot mean to defend her over this. Think of your position. Think of what people will say. I have spent a great deal of time recently thinking about exactly that, Julian said, turning to face her directly, and I have come to understand that what people will say matters a great deal less to me than what is true, and what is right. Eleanor Hartley did nothing wrong tonight, or any night before it. The wrong belongs entirely to those of us who thought her worth less than we were, simply because circumstance had stripped her of the title her birth once gave her. The hall remained silent, absorbing this, and Eleanor stood beside him with her chin lifted despite the burning in her eyes, refusing, even now, to let the tears building there fall in front of a room that had already taken enough from her without also claiming the satisfaction of her visible pain. I think, she said finally into the heavy quiet, that I would like to go home. I will take you, Julian said at once. No, she shook her head, gently but firmly. I think, Your Grace, that I need to go somewhere that is truly mine, not Camden House. Not a place I have only ever occupied as a servant. She looked around the hall one final time, at the faces watching her, some sympathetic, some still cold with judgment, and something in her seemed to settle into a decision she had perhaps been circling for days without quite admitting it to herself. I have spent 8 years hiding who I was, and 2 weeks ago I finally stopped, and even now, even standing here exposed in front of all of you, I find I do not regret it. But I cannot keep living inside a story where my worth depends on whether a room full of strangers approves of my history. I need time. I need to decide, for myself, who I intend to become next. She turned and walked from the hall without waiting for anyone's response, her back straight, her steps steady, leaving behind a silence so complete that the orchestra, uncertain whether to resume playing, simply did not, and the Ashford ball ended that night in a hush no one present would ever fully forget. Eleanor did not return to Camden House that night. She walked instead to Brackenfield, arriving well past midnight at Mrs. Pemberton's small cottage, and the older woman, roused from sleep by the frantic knocking at her door, took one look at Eleanor's tear-streaked face and opened the door without a single question, wrapping her in a blanket and settling her by the fire until the shaking finally eased enough for words to come. They knew, Eleanor said finally, staring into the flames. They knew about my father, about everything, and they said it in front of the entire hall, as though my history were a weapon to be used against me, rather than simply a fact of my life. And the Duke? Mrs. Pemberton asked gently. He defended me, Eleanor admitted. Publicly, without hesitation. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and I still walked away from him, because I realized, standing in that hall, that I have spent my entire adult life being defined by other people. My father's ruin, my mother's grief, the Duke's cruel joke, and now, perhaps, the Duke's rescue. I do not want to be rescued, Mrs. Pemberton. I want to simply be myself, without needing anyone's permission to matter. That is a wise thing to want, Mrs. Pemberton said, though I suspect it is also a lonely thing, if you insist on wanting it entirely alone. Eleanor said nothing to this, though the words settled into her thoughts and remained there through the following days, as she stayed on in Brackenfield helping Mrs. Pemberton with her dressmaking, discovering in the quiet, steady work a satisfaction she had not expected, a sense of purpose built entirely on her own skill and effort, rather than on any inherited name or borrowed silk. News of the scandal, meanwhile, spread through the county with predictable speed and predictable division. Some households sided firmly with Lord Reginald and Lady Cordelia, scandalized that a servant would have dared present herself among her betters under any circumstances. But a surprising number sided with Eleanor, moved by the story of a young woman who had lost everything through no fault of her own, and had faced her humiliation, twice now, with more grace than the people attempting to inflict it. Mrs. Bell, when questioned by curious neighbors, spoke of Eleanor's years of faithful service with such evident warmth that several listeners found their sympathies shifting entirely. Julian, for his part, spent the days following the ball, in a state he did not entirely recognize in himself, restless and distracted, unable to settle properly into any of his usual occupations. He rode to Brackenfield twice, only to turn back both times before reaching Mrs. Pemberton's cottage, uncertain whether his presence would be welcomed or would simply confirm every doubt Eleanor had voiced that terrible night at the Ashford ball. It was Mrs. Bell, finally, who pushed him past his hesitation. "You are behaving, Your Grace, like a man afraid of his own decision," she said to him one morning, with the bluntness of 11 years' service that had earned her the right to speak plainly. "Either you believe what you said in that hall, or you do not. If you believe it, go and tell her so directly, rather than riding halfway to Brackenfield and losing your nerve." He went that same afternoon, and this time he did not turn back. He found Eleanor in Mrs. Pemberton's small workroom, a length of gray wool spread across the table before her, a needle moving steadily through the fabric with a competence that spoke of days already spent learning this new trade. She looked up when he entered, and something complicated moved across her face, surprise and wariness and, beneath both, something warmer that she did not immediately try to hide. "Your Grace." "Julian," he corrected gently, "if you are willing." She set down her needle. "What are you doing here?" "Making certain you understand something," he said, "that I do not think I said clearly enough. That night in the hall, I did not defend you because I felt some obligation as your employer, or even because I had begun to care for you, though I have, more than I quite know what to do with. I defended you because what Reginald and Cordelia did was wrong, entirely apart from anything I feel toward you personally. Your worth was never something I gave you by inviting you to dinner, and it is not something you lost by walking away from that ball. It was always yours, Eleanor. I was simply slow enough, and blind enough, to take 3 years to notice it." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing the words, weighing perhaps something larger than the words themselves, the whole shape of what it might mean to let herself trust a man who had, not so very long ago, seen her as nothing more than an object of casual cruelty. "I do not want to be a duchess, simply because a duke decided, eventually, to see me clearly," she said finally. "I want to build something of my own first, something that belongs entirely to me, that no one can take away or use against me, the way Lord Reginald tried to." "Then build it," Julian said simply. "I am not here to rescue you, Eleanor. I understood that much at least, standing in that hall watching you walk away. I am here because I find that my life, these past 2 weeks, has felt considerably less honest without you in it, and I would like the chance to know you properly, on whatever terms you choose to set, for as long as you are willing to allow it." Something in her posture eased, slowly, the careful guardedness she had maintained since the ball softening into something closer to the woman who had once sat across from him at dinner, matching his cruelty with grace, and turning an entire room's mockery back upon itself. "I am staying in Brackenfield," she said, "for now. Mrs. Pemberton has offered to teach me her trade properly, and I find I want to learn it, not as a servant's occupation, but as a skill entirely my own." "Then I will visit," Julian said. "As often as you will permit, not as your duke, and not as your employer. simply as a man who very much wishes to know you. It was not, in that moment, a proposal, nor an ending tied neatly into a bow, and both of them understood that plainly. It was, instead, a beginning, honest and uncertain, and built on considerably more solid ground than the cruel joke that had first thrown them together. And over the weeks that followed, Julian's visits to Brackenfield became a regular and welcome feature of both their lives, conversations lengthening into afternoons, afternoons lengthening into an understanding, neither of them rushed to name aloud. Lord Reginald and Lady Cordelia, for their part, found the county's sympathy shifting steadily against them as the full details of their scheme became known. Mrs. Bell's testimony, and the Duke's own public account of the letter Reginald had commissioned, painting a picture considerably less flattering than the one they had hoped to create. Cordelia, humiliated and increasingly unwelcome in circles that had once embraced her, eventually left for London, and Reginald's reputation among his peers never fully recovered from the discovery that he had built a public scandal on private grief simply to serve his own petty resentments. It was nearly a year later, on a bright autumn afternoon, that Julian returned once more to Brackenfield, and this time he did not come merely to visit. He found Eleanor in the small shop she had opened with Mrs. Pemberton's blessing and considerable help, her own name painted modestly above the door, her skill with a needle now known well enough that ladies from 3 counties over had begun seeking her out directly. "I have a question for you," he said, and something in his voice made her set down her work at once. "Ask it then." "I am not asking you to become a duchess because I once made the mistake of inviting you to dinner as a joke," he said. "I am asking because I have spent a year watching you build a life entirely on your own strength, and I find I would very much like to spend the rest of mine beside you, however you choose to shape it. Will you marry me, Eleanor Hartley, not as the punchline of a cruel story, but as exactly the woman you have proven yourself to be?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had once summoned her to a drawing room intending to humiliate her, and who had, in the year since, become someone entirely different in her understanding, someone who had learned, slowly and honestly, to see her clearly. "Yes," she said finally, "not because you are a duke, and not despite it, but because I have finally come to know exactly who you are, the same way you have finally come to know exactly who I am." She smiled, and for the first time since that terrible evening in the drawing room where this entire story began, the smile reached fully into her eyes. "It seems, Your Grace, that your cruel joke arrived at a rather better ending than either of us expected." "The best endings usually do," Julian said, and took her hand in his. The wedding took place the following spring in the small stone chapel nearest Camden House, and Eleanor insisted, against considerable protest from several of Julian's more traditional relations, that Mrs. Pemberton be seated in the front pew, alongside the county's finest families, since without her steady hands and steadier kindness, there would have been no blue silk gown, and perhaps no story worth telling at all. Margaret stood beside Eleanor throughout the ceremony, no longer a fellow maid but a trusted friend elevated to companion, and wept openly through most of it, though she insisted afterward that the tears were entirely those of happiness. News of the wedding traveled quickly through the county, as such news always did, and the story of the maid who had arrived at a cruel dinner dressed like a duchess and had gone on to become one in earnest took its place among the tales the county's families told each other for years afterward, though the telling changed considerably depending on who did the telling. Lady Cordelia, from her new circles in London, was said to describe the entire affair with careful vagueness, omitting her own role in its ugliest chapter. Lord Reginald, whose fortunes had continued their slow decline in the years since, was rarely mentioned at all, his name quietly dropped from guest lists across 3 counties. Eleanor did not abandon her small shop in Brackenfield, despite her new title, though she visited it now as its owner rather than its apprentice, and Mrs. Pemberton, well into her later years, took quiet satisfaction in watching the business grow into something that would outlast her, carried forward by a young woman she had come to think of as something very near a daughter. Julian, for his part, found that marriage to a woman who had spent years learning to survive on her own resourcefulness had changed him in ways he had not anticipated, softening the careless arrogance of his younger years into a quieter, more thoughtful sense of his own position and its responsibilities. He took to visiting his tenants personally, something his father had rarely bothered with, and more than one household on the Camden estate noted, with quiet approval, that the young Duke had grown considerably more attentive to the lives of those who served him since his marriage. They had, in time, 2 children, a daughter with her mother's steady gray eyes and a son who showed, from a very early age, an alarming talent for cutting remarks that left dinner guests uncertain whether to laugh or apologize. a trait his mother found endlessly amusing, and his father found, more often than not, entirely too familiar. On quiet evenings, when the household had settled and the children were long asleep, Eleanor sometimes returned to the small trunk that had once held her mother's silk and pearls, now nearly empty, its contents long since put to use, and thought of the frightened, furious young woman who had stood in a drawing room 8 years earlier, being invited to dinner as a joke. She did not regret the years of hardship that had shaped her, though she would not have wished them on anyone, and she understood, with a clarity that had taken her most of her life to earn, that the cruelty which had once been meant to break her had instead, through nothing but her own refusal to be diminished by it, become the very thing that finally set her free. "What are you thinking of?" Julian asked her one evening, finding her by the window with the old trunk open beside her. "Of how strange it is," Eleanor said, "that the worst evening of my life became the beginning of the best one." "I have often thought the same," Julian admitted, coming to sit beside her, "though I confess I still feel the shame of it, sometimes, remembering the man I was that first night." "Do not," Eleanor said gently, closing the trunk and taking his hand. "That man is not the one I married. And I have found over the years that the people worth loving are rarely the people we were at our worst moment, but the people we choose to become afterward." She smiled, the same steady, knowing smile she had once worn walking into a dining hall full of people who wished to see her humbled. "You chose well, Julian." "So did I." Outside, the last light of evening settled gently over Camden House, and inside, in the quiet warmth of a home built slowly and honestly out of what had once been intended as nothing more than a cruel joke, the story that the county would tell for generations finally, truly, came to its rest.